Right.
That was a suitably ominous sounding message.
Yes, it is, isn't it? It's probably not a real person's voice. It's probably computer
Oh,
generated, but I don't know. I mean, it would be quite good to be the person that does that because one could always slip into that kind of uh, ominous way of describing things, in personal life, maybe could be quite fun. Now, I was so we'll have a few moments of silence. I'll light a candle, say a few words in Old Norse, and introduce the topic. Ljósbyggja gallar helga kindir, meiri og minni, mögu heimdalar. Heilt kvöld og heilig kvöld sýnir, heil nótt og nýtt, og reglum ákomið sinnig, og gefið sitt tónum sitt. Branda af brand I brændingsbunden funitrækkes af fundet mad af manifest af maditur and til dalske af død. Flame is quickened by flame. A man from another man may become wiser, but from his own conceit may remain ignorant. Truth, like the sky, is above and beyond us all. Blessed gods of our peoples and lands, may we spend this time together in friendship with you and each other, and use it to the common good, with profit and with pleasure. Odin. Indo-Europeanism is a thing, an orientation of inspiration, a reaching back to the time before Christianity, when a continuous network of linearly descended indigenous spiritual centres bestrode 2 continents and laid, like lungs, upon the map. As its name implies, it has 2 main branches. The first, which one could call Hindu Dharma, is still a living faith and has never been extinguished since its origin in remotest time. And the second, European paganism, is not, and sadly more or less collapsed over 1,000 years in the face of Christianity, with many of the ingredients that made it what it is irrecoverably lost. One of them being, of course, continuity, which cannot be disregarded in the case of a tradition that is primarily about practice, as paganism is. Just as the proper diet to allow the body to thrive to the optimal extent will contain in appropriate proportion all the necessary complementary ingredients and be good to eat, likewise will the proper religion to allow the whole person to thrive be composed of all the necessary complementary ingredients and will be a pleasure to practice, lending strength to the spirit to sustain the person to testing times of pain and despair. The followers of Hindu Dharma did in their homeland what we in Europe did not do. They kept the faith, and inspired by warriors like Shivaji, they upheld the honour of Indo-European religion against the Mongols and the missionaries. And today they have thus earned access to a profusion of all the necessary ingredients for a well-balanced religion, unlike us. Since the 18th century, Europeans have been entranced by the Indo-European identitarian idea, drawn to it, I think, by a desire to rediscover a primal wholeness of being, a reuniting with a lost other half. Being Indo-European in one's religious affiliation does not mean that one would worship all and any deity belonging to the countless pantheons of this vast sphere. Being pagan is to acknowledge deity at its most particularly present aspect, as it manifests itself directly to one's land, in relation to one's peoples and lands, and as it most particularly presents itself to the person who one is and one's station in life. It is to try to live well upon what has been nearly given, but never to live below the level one can attain to, because what is needful is not near and in easy reach. That's to say, to become the person one is supposed to be, in addition to the remnants of one's own tradition, such as the Eddas, one may need to read Plato and Ovid. In addition to the Iliad and Odyssey, one may need to read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. I would have uttered a further parallel clause, but I could think of nothing compared to the Vedas, which stand at the profoundest root of the tree. The whole issue would not be current if the world were now not being carved up by the two Abrahamic superpowers. Speaking as a European pagan, I think we must recognise our weakness and do what we can to become strong in a rightful way, following the gods, and attempt to occupy the vacuum at the heart of the West before others do. Indo-Europeanism is not just an invitation to subscribe to a greater canon of scripture in order to help understand more clearly the few fragments that remain of one's own. It's also an invitation to stand back from the arrogance of the present in all ways and patronisingly thinking it is superior to the past, to escape the imprisonment of the contemporary agendas and pathologically unnatural individualism that I very much, for one, am still trying to cleanse myself of. In the Bronze Age, from which the aforementioned works descend, when life was so much simpler and so much harder, it seems to have been easier to perceive the eternal within the transitory, to sense what the natural way of living is, to know what Dharma is. With that, I warmly invite our guest, Corinne, to speak. Thank you, Corinne.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And when I say thank you for a lovely introduction, I don't mean to me, I mean to this entire sphere of conversation. That was frankly beautiful.
Thank you. I should say that I, as a principle, I never say anything about the speaker, because the topic is always more important than all of us.
Well, I completely agree. It's something I tried to get across to you when you were sort of insisting that I talk about my personal background and introducing the topic in our planning discussions. But that's another matter for another time. Actually, it's not as matter for this time directly. Okay, so I'd like to start with two quotes. The first one, since I'm speaking to a primarily UK-based audience, such as the kingdom may still be united for the foreseeable future, is actually chiselled onto the side of the Scottish Parliament. It's from a writer by the name of Alistair Gray. And he said something which I used to quote quite often in my previous life in politics: work as if you lived in the early days of a better nation. Now, this, I believe, is pretty much the crux of what we're trying to do here. As has been pointed out, with the Hindu sphere, which for various strange reasons we'll get into in a moment, I happen to belong to, it's not the early days of a better nation. It's an incredibly advanced nation that's in an advanced state of decay, as Sashi Thoreau once pointed out, and which is doing everything in its power to prevent that decay from further sort of gnawing away at the roots of the tree, if you will. In the rest of the Indo-European sphere, by contrast, it really does seem like there's some sort of great awakening going on, like there's some sort of sunrise coming out of the east, or if you happen to be in New Zealand, I suppose it's coming from somewhere in the northwest in that particular direction. And it's on each of us and all of us to actually attempt to radiate that light into our own localized spheres. Now, in terms of the second quote, which I wanted to sort of introduce the topic with, there's a guy by the name of Robert Graves. Now, I'm not a fan of this. In fact, it's a frequent thing that the writers I find myself quoting the most are the ones I'm not fans of. I think Aristophanes, who I am a fan of, as it happens, had something to say of that particular nature. But in terms of this Robert Graves quote, this is from his work, Greek Gods and Heroes, in a chapter entitled The Death of the Olympian Gods. Open quotation marks. As soon as the Emperor Julian of Constantinople, the last of the Roman emperors to worship the Olympians, had been killed fighting the Persians in AD 363, Zeus was told by the three fates that his reign had ended, he and his friends must leave Olympus. Zeus angrily destroyed the palace with a thunderbolt, and they all went off to live among humble country people, hoping for better times. But Christian missionaries chased them out with the sign of the cross, turned their temples into churches, which they divided among the leading saints, end quote. Now, the reason why I've chosen to start with that particular quote is because it represents the utter arrogance that we seek to counter with our work. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that the situation of the West over the last, 2,000 years, if not longer, has been one of tragedy. And there's something noble in that. We could probably have a long and involved discussion about the Greek tragic ideals involved in that, because, of course, Greek tragedy is fundamentally about some characteristic innate to the hero that they are unable or unwilling to overcome, particularly because they're too, lacking in perspicacity to be able to perceive that about themselves. And we'll encounter that further when we come to the Macaulay example in a moment. But in terms of this, the tragedy which that quote sort of talks about, it's the idea that because, Julian and co wound up going south, and the efforts of Julian the apostate didn't come to proper fruition, that this meant the gods were dead, that this meant man's connection to the gods were dead. It's an incredibly presumptuous thing, especially because in Northern Europe, for 800 years after that particular instance which is talked about, in the Scandinavian sphere, the religion was still a very much living concern. Even after that, for maybe not all that long, because the Northern Crusades swept through it, in Lithuania, we still find Baltic paganism being practiced. This idea that because something had been lost in this very narrow, but still quite vital sphere of Europe, it meant the entire thing was over and kaput. Well, that was a very limiting thing indeed, and one that has fundamentally led to our great difficulties with the resurrection of the Indo-European spirituality in the West today, because people fall into one of two camps when we talk about these sorts of things. They either fall into the camp which presumes that the entire thing, as I've said, dead, gone, buried, can't be recovered, no point, so therefore why not go and do something else, possibly indulge in spiritual nihilism. Or alternatively, they think that because their local and ancestral tradition is dead or moribund, that this therefore means that the entire great wellspring has similarly dried up. Now, this is the reason why it's so vital for us to be talking about Hinduism today, because as has been pointed out, this once mighty world tree, if you will, of the Indo-European faith, the branches to the west have withered. They've been chopped off, hacked down, whatever you want to call it. In the east, this is not the case. The fruit is still there. Birds are singing in the trees of various sorts, including, interestingly enough, ravens, as I found out, as possessed by the god Rudra. But in terms of this health over here, the question becomes, how do we how do we grow? It's not about transferring or appropriating. We must always make that absolutely clear due to the colonial experience. How do we grow things so the life which we find so abundantly in the East is also available to us here in the West? That is the essential question which we're going to be looking at here today. Now, at this point, I'm going to segue back into my own background because, as I said, it was requested of me that I talk a bit about it, and also because I think it's possibly rather useful when it comes to illustrating some of the things I'm talking about. Specifically, the manner in which one can become Indo-European without giving up the fact that one is also European, or going the other way with regard to some of my devotees, how one can remain Indian while also becoming Indo-European, but more upon that in a moment. So, in terms of my background and roots, it's always vitally important to know one's roots because I can't remember whether it's Dubois or Marcus Garvey, but he said that if you didn't know where your roots are and where you come from, it's very difficult indeed to know where you're going. My ethnic origins, insofar as they're relevant, with a name like Rollinson, they're Germanic, they're Nordic, they're Swedish, so those sorts of Northern European climes. I'm also significantly Breton, which is tremendously having to explain to people does not mean British, although of course there is that Brythonic sort of relationship, because one of my perhaps rather illustrious forebears was so fed up with France being in an internecine state of civil war. He said it would get as far away as humanly possible from it, and so moved to New Zealand, which is literally on the other side of the world. So that was basically it. This does, of course, mean that parts of my family have, in fact, deified Napoleon. But that is possibly another matter for another time, possibly in mid-August when his birthday rolls around. Anyway, in terms of how I wound up in the Hindu sphere, Hinduism in New Zealand is probably the second largest religion in the country. In fact, it's not probably, it's definitely. I've looked at the census data to confirm this. This isn't because it's a double-digit sized faith, however, but rather because A, Christianity is significantly declining, as our host has pointed out, thus leaving something of a gulf which things must be sort of moved into. But also B, because we have a large and well-integrated series of Indian, Nepali, Indo-Fijian, and other associated demographics here, which are a vital and significant part of, well, many cities, but in Auckland, where I'm living, we have an entire Indian district, which makes it very, very handy when one is seeking to source various ritual ingredients, etc., which I occasionally forget are a lot more difficult to come by if people elsewhere in the world, but I digress. As part of these waves of migration, I wound up with Indo-Nepali adoptive family. What happened was, when I was very small, my mother played an instrumental role helping out one family and their daughter in question. So therefore, as an older man, I say, but somebody in my early to mid-20s, it came time for the debt of honor to be sort of, as they sort of put it, to be fulfilled. And so they decided to, I suppose you might say, adopt me, teach me things, look after me in various sorts of regards, and help me to find my way in the world at a time that I was experiencing quite some personal difficulty. We won't go into the nature of the personal difficulty, except to say that it was suitably Odinic, insofar as I was mad, possibly a criminal, and facing a significant stay of imprisonment, which we beat thanks to divine intervention, but that is another matter, as I say, for another time. What wound up happening was, during the course of these perilous life circumstances, my older sister, my Didi, said to me, "We're taking you to Mandara to sort your life out." Mandara is, of course, a temple. And lo and behold, it did. I wound up not only basically getting over a significant drug addiction by spending, sort of 2 evenings a week, every week for the next, 6.5, 7 years at the temple in question, but also spending several months stationed at a Shiv Mandir, a Shaivite temple in South Auckland. Out there every morning, crack of dawn for the morning arati, learning from the Acharyaji, a Nath lineage Nepali Pandit, and impressing them, indeed, with what I was doing and my zeal with which I was doing it. To the point that, well, they said, "You're no longer Gora," Gora meaning sort of white person, "you're Indian. We'll find you a bride, we'll marry you into the community to complete the transition." Now, I gracefully declined the offer of the arranged marriage in that particular regard for a number of reasons, but it was an incredible compliment for obvious reasons. But more than that, they offered me the opportunity to return to that particular temple and train up as a pandit, as a priest, when I was ready to do so, which was overlooking my, I suppose you might say, racial handicap, in terms of the fact that, generally speaking, you wouldn't expect, well, first up, somebody non-Brahmin, depending upon whereabouts you're talking about, but also second, somebody non-Indian to be able to, well, be offered such an opportunity. Now, in terms of how I've been able to do all of this, especially when it comes to having rites and stuff done at my sort of my home temple in the early days before the priests there sort of gotten my measure, the main way I was able to do it was because I had this adoptive family. This meant that when we were going along to get my Rudrabhishek done immediately before the High Court appeal we launched, which I still have the buttons from on my wrist, as you can see, even after sort of 5.5 years, they could go in and say, "Look, this is our son, treat him as you would our son, and if there's any sort of difficulties in interpretation, we can sort of, we'll be there, his older sister, my parents, so on and so forth, to facilitate and make sure things work as they should." Now, that was incredibly useful for me. But the issue that we have, of course, is that most people out there in the European sphere don't happen to have Indo-Nepali adoptive family. For them, going into a Hindu temple is, well, first up, the difficulty of being able to find one. It's occurred to me that my situation with half a dozen within walking distance is probably not what most European cities have. One of our associates who I sort of look after and have just helped to set up this home shrine in Eastern Europe, if he wanted to find a Hindu temple, he'd have to drive for several hours into Germany to find one. It's just not a viable situation, especially on a daily or weekly basis. And once he got there, he'd face the psychological and also ritual barriers of being the only European in the entire place, which even some years into it, it can be quite an intimidating thing because, of course, I go along in Mahashivratri, one of our big festivals every year, and there's 1,000 people of India, Cambodia, Nepal, so on and so forth, and there's little old me, just sort of the only Gora in the mandir, which can be quite a, well, we get around it by knowing what we're doing to be self-assured in that sort of regard, but it can be quite intimidating for somebody else, as we've talked about with other people we've helped to engage in that particular journey. So the question becomes how it is that we can make available these fruits of the Hindu tree to people who don't have these easy ins to the Hindu sphere, as I was lucky enough to receive. And alongside that, that subsidiary question we also talked about of just how far one actually has to venture into the Hindu sphere in order to actually attain those particular benefits. Now, I'll start with the second one first. The reason why I mentioned earlier this essential question about how to remain European while also being Indo-European is because a lot of people have a psychological barrier when it comes to these sorts of things. And in some cases, it's quite an understandable one. Everybody wants to respect and uphold their own heritage, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that in the slightest. Everybody wants the integrality which comes with that. Everybody wants to experience a genuine sense of connectivity with their ancestors, and of course, their ancestors, the gods whom they happen to descend from. For as I've often pointed out, to be Indo-European is to be descended from the gods. Not in necessarily the sort of way some people might take that, but on a brief tangent, I often digress in these sorts of regards, it's something which often strikes me when looking over the Iliad. Now, in the Iliad, the heroes, the protagonists, most of the people of note in that book know exactly where they come from. They know their place in the world. They know which gods they descend from, often not necessarily all that far back in the family tree. They have an essential connection, therefore, to the world around them, something which we often in the sort of the more modern sphere find ourselves sadly lacking in favor of an isolated and atomized individualism, wherein roots are whatever you put down like some sort of camera tripod, wherever you might so happen to be at the time. But as I said, I digress. Now, often when it comes to Europeans or Americans who've wound up in the Hindu sphere or adjacent to the Hindu sphere, as the case may be, we're thinking of Hare Krishnas and things like that. Now, I say adjacent to the Hindu sphere because, frankly, a lot of Hare Krishnas will not identify as Hindus. And considering some of the chicanery which some of them get up to, a lot of Hindus are quite happy that they do not do so. They give the side a bad name, we might say. Like, for example, they have a theological doctrine about Muhammad, as in the Prophet Muhammad, being a partially empowered avatar of Vishnu. It's a very strange system in some regards, but we're not here to talk about them. The reason why I raised them is because any large city can think instantly of a bunch of people dressed in pointedly sort of pseudo-Indian fashion. Like Indian community doesn't dress like that. But it's a sort of almost a Hollywood sort of pastiche thereof, with their well, we use the European term, the ponytail sort of style of hair, with their sort of saffron clothing, with their drums and their accordions, wandering the streets every Friday night, shouting the names of God. Now, I have to say, I have a slight soft spot for them in that regard, because there is something glorious and joyous about a bunch of people just wandering around the place on a Friday night, loudly singing praises of the divine. They get a point for that. However, they also wind up effectively, whether it's due to insistence or simply sort of the insistency of being in a context, with those conscious eschewments of the European side of things. So you find them all taking Sanskrit names, for example, dressing in the manner which I've talked about, and fundamentally really going the whole hog and reorienting themselves around that particular cult which they're now a part of. For some people, that is an appropriate pathway. But I don't think for many people that is either appropriate or necessary, especially because, as I said, one of the things which we're trying to do is resurrect the essential sense of connection with our own heritage, even if it must, either via necessity or via comfortability, be expressed via our cousins over here in the Hindu sphere. So being able to show that we can remain European while also being Indo-European is absolutely vital in that regard, because that's what it effectively means. To be able to acknowledge the commonality, the coterminity, the shared essence and DNA, without losing out on what makes us distinct, any more than we would expect people in the Hindu sphere to lose out or to consciously eschew what makes them, us, and, well, as far as I'm part of it, distinct as well, and gives it that particular series of unique and often highly regional spices, so to speak. We're not here to homogenize and roll out some sort of globalist or McWorld paradigm, if you will. Now, in terms of, how do I say, some of the considerations around that, and those psychological barriers which we often encounter, there's a point which I have been meaning to talk about, and that's Macaulayism, especially because it actually does sort of tie in, we may say, with that notion of asking people in the Indian sphere to give up being Indian. It also helps to explain one of the vitally important considerations which Europeans must have when it comes to engaging with the Hindu sphere. Because frankly, there's a bit of a PCSD, we may say, post-colonial stress disorder, which is entirely understandable when it comes to the Hindu sphere. If you spend 200 years with the people who sort of are taking an interest in your religion, being those who turn up to basically go, okay, so how do we get to grips with this religion so that we may destroy it, so that we may convert them into sort of a Christian sort of religion, so that we may write them off as being barbarous savages, so that we may more effectively administer this sort of territory as a place of empire with all that entails, or so that we may appropriate everything that's not nailed down and say, you didn't build that, a bunch of white people did 3,000 years ago. It's quite understandable that in the 21st century, when you find a European turning up in your spiritual context, that there is an initial suspicion as to what he may be about, especially because online, sadly, often the people who have an overt interest in words like Aryan or displaying a swastika tend to have rather more in common with American prison gangs than any genuine religious advancement. I say often because, of course, there are always exceptions and we are growing by the day. But that, as I say, that's just sort of explaining the context. Now, this situation of Macaulayism, we're going to go back in time about 1,000 years, which is an easy thing to do, to say like that, but of course far harder to do in practice. Mahmud of Ghazni. Now, the waves of Islam sort of sweeping into the subcontinent, it was quite an impressive thing, both in terms of the extreme force which was brought to bear upon the northwestern sort of periphery of India, but also the extreme force which was brought to bear in resisting it. And the Hindu Shahi, absolute heroes for a number of reasons, but this is not about them. Mahmud of Ghazni was a rather zealous man, we may say, and decided, in fact, declared that he was going to raid India repeatedly as the land of the infidel and carry off its wealth and its, its holy relics in order to enrich his particular religion and the community back in Afghanistan. His last raid, I think from memory that was his last raid, was a rather famous one in which he attacked the Somnath Jyotirlingam. Now, a Jyotirlingam is, well, we'll discuss lingams in a bit. I've got mine down here to sort of to show to the class. We'll just say it's a really holy Shaivite sort of site, rather commensurate with an Irminsul in the sort of the Germanic sphere, we might sort of suggest. It was fabulously wealthy, and he raided it. He despoiled it. He desecrated it. His reason for it was because he presumed that Somnath, in fact, meant Sumanat, Manat was one of the pre-Islamic pagan deities of Mecca, which had been driven out in one of the original acts of iconoclasm by Muhammad when his group was taking over that particular city. So Mahmud saw his role there as an effective Iliadian eternal return, if you will, a mythic recurrence to finish what his prophet had started. So he attacked Somnath, and he wrought incredible destruction upon it. He carried off the Lingam in question. He shattered it, and he took the shards and installed it in the floor of a mosque in his home city, so that it would ever and always be under the feet of the Islamic worshippers in question, which is a, well, you can imagine what I think of that. Now, having said that, there's an expression in Sanskrit which I won't try and regale you with. My pronunciation is often a bit off, but it means the subtle play of Lord Shiva's wit. And in terms of what then happened to Mahmud of Ghazni, he picked up a particular virus which nobody could cure on that particular raid into India. And he never managed to attack India in meaningful strength again. His empire started fragmenting almost immediately afterwards, and it found itself, just as he had smashed up that Jyotirlinga, smashed and riven asunder between his rival feuding sons. It was quite an incredible instance of what we might term contrapasso in the Italian. There's a direct Sanskrit figurative, how would you say, co-expression of that understanding for the punishments of Lord Yama in the underworld, which again, we won't bother with the actual sort of pronunciation. But why I've brought all of that up as sort of background is because during the first Anglo-Afghan War, the Governor General, the British Governor General, did something quite grand. Now, I often give the British quite a bit of stick about various colonial bits and pieces for a number of reasons, possibly including my French ancestry. But in terms of this particular Governor General, it was something grand. Leading an army that was significantly comprised of Hindus, Hindu Indians in British service. When they carried out their victorious invasion of Afghanistan, one of the few victorious invasions of Afghanistan, of course, for obvious reasons in the modern age, he made a point of liberating from the mausoleum of Mahmud of Ghazni the fine sandalwood doors that had also been carried off from this Somnath temple all of those centuries before, and bringing them back to India in a fully almost sort of classical triumph, like he was very much aware of the moment that he was engaged in there, and presenting them with a proclamation that this was basically sort of British and Indian, Hindu Indian, working together to restore a lost glory of Bharat. It's an incredible speech. I've quoted it elsewhere because it really is quite good. Of course, as it happened, the sandalwood doors in question turned out to be later reproductions, so they were never actually reinstalled upon the temple in question. But that's not why I'm talking about this particular instance today. Rather, it's because what happened immediately afterwards was this British Governor General was hauled back in proverbial irons, not literally, but proverbially, to the British Parliament, where he was castigated and excoriated by Lord Macaulay. Why this was so was because Macaulay felt that it was exactly the antithesis of what the British Empire should be about. In fact, he actually said, as a matter of official British policy, it should be to favor the Mohammedan over the Brahminical faith, as he put it. In fact, he went rather further with his demeaning and sort of disparaging approach to basically everything by saying that the Governor General in question had favored the Shaivite faith, phallus worshippers, as he called us, and that if he was forced to choose an Indian denomination, he would prefer to be a Vaishnava, which I've always found rather amusing, but that's another matter. Now, the reason I bring this up is because Lord Macaulay was a famed classicist. If you ever heard the Lays of Ancient Rome, which features that incredibly memorable series of verses about Horatius, the captain of the gates, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? Everybody knows that line. It's in fact emblazoned upon a war memorial in India from the against the Chinese invasion in 1962. But in terms of this particular figure, eminent classicist that he was besotted with the classical world, and he found himself confronted with the living cousin to that classical religion. He couldn't deny it. It was in the academic text at the time. In fact, I think he wrote the Lays of India. Well, sorry, not the Lays of India. That'd be a very different poem. The Lays of Ancient Rome while he was in India. But you see, it created this cognitive dissonance for Macaulay, because he wanted to idolize and to lionize the religion of the Romans, the Greeks, that sort of end of things. And yet at the same time, being confronted with this living religion, which he had to demonize and disparage, he had to draw all of these artificial distinctions, artificial barriers between these two particular spheres. It's a symptom in some ways of that 1800s attitude we often find with regard to classical subject matter. I call it the British bank attitude, because if you look at, say, a British bank, they're often, well, at least they used to be, rather well constructed architecturally speaking. They have fine engaged columns and pilasters, and they look like Roman or Greek temples, except for the fact they're utterly colorless. They're white, they're marble, they're bare stone, as with the statuary which we think of today when it comes to classical sculpture, which is utterly the opposite of the riotous displays of color we actually see when it comes to classical edifices and religious devotional sculpture, as it was understood by the people who built them in the first place. As you can see, a sort of sanitized view of the past has been produced, which has very little to do with the actual past as it was livingly engaged with, and a lot to do with our present day sensibilities. I'm sorry, somebody's having a coughing fit in there. I hope it's not with regard to my vocalization. But in terms of this sort of mentality, this is why I do a lot of what I do, because that Macaulayist approach, it looks over at its cousins over there in the Hindu sphere, and all it's capable of seeing is, oh, these degenerates, these savages, these barbarians, we must define ourselves in opposition to this. We're white, we're not like these brown people, and stuff of that particular nature. Somebody's probably going to quote that 5 seconds out of context. It's going to be horrible. But in terms of that sort of thing, we must overcome that and see what the actual coterminity is. And we must be able to critically examine the agendas of some of those people out there who really do want to try and emphasize the difference as opposed to that shared heritage. Now, in terms of the actual, the archaeology, if you will, the epistemology, I should probably say, of academic sort of engagement with Hinduism, even 150 years after Macaulay, there are still problems of this nature which we must encounter and grapple with. One of the big ones we frequently encounter, and it does my head in, is this notion of, oh, there's the Vedic religion over here, and there's the post-Vedic Puranic, modern Hinduism or whatever over here. Oh yes, we have coterminity with the Vedic religion. We don't have anything to do with Puranic religion. That's the the local Dravidian faith or whatever. Now, we shouldn't use Dravidian as a sort of a negative descriptor. There are a number of reasons for this, one of which is we don't go around just sort of declaring that any particular ethnic group, or sorry, an ethnic group, any particular designation of that nature is an insult. It shouldn't be, especially because when it comes to why we have the living Indo-European religion in India, a large part of that is because in South India, swathes of it were never conquered. Swathes of it never gave way. Swathes of it could therefore reignite the flames in the north, even after people like Aurangzeb had conspired to extinguish it as much as possible. And even to this day, if you want to hear really traditional Vedic lineage continuation, sort of chanting of the ancient rites, you go to South India. When about half a century ago now, when some anthropologists wanted to record a Agnikayana, which is a firebird rite, it's interestingly enough mythically concordant with the obtaining of the meat of poetry by Odin in sort of equal form, but we'll cover that in a bit. When they wanted to record an Agnikayana rite, which involves constructing this massive altar using bricks in the shape of a falcon to then sort of carry out, it takes multiple days. You get the sort of the elixir of life afterwards, etc. They had to go to South India in order to be able to perform, to record it on film, because that was basically where these things were still alive and preserved. It's a remarkable thing. So in terms of Dravidian, well, apart from the fact that in genetic terms, and we really should be very cautious about being overly besotted about the literal genetic side of things, because nobody is purely Indo-European. Everybody, whether you're European, Indian, especially in the Scandinavian sphere, funny enough, on a haplogroup sort of basis, you are mixed with something that is not Proto-Indo-European. Everybody has multiple sources of heritage, multiple sources of strength, I would probably prefer to say. Anyway, sorry, sidetrack. I just often feel the need to defend my Dravidian, well, associates, comrades, devotees in this particular regard, because they come in for quite a lot of stick in various quarters. Side issue. Where was I going with all that? Oh, sorry, yes, Vedic and Puranic. Okay, so with this division, we should probably get to grips with some basic terminology, because often I forget that not everybody is sort of adroit with it. The Vedas are Shruti. Shruti is, how to put it, texts which are heard, by which I mean they weren't written per se, not just because it's an old tradition, but because they were the result of direct divine revelation to the rishis, the seers in question. So they didn't; these rishis didn't really sort of compose things in the sense of an author like Homer. They heard things, they perceived things, and then sort of put them together in that regard. That's why they're a higher grade of canonicity in terms of the religious elements in question. The other category, the big category of scriptural elements, is smriti, which means that which is remembered, that which is recalled, because of course you hear it from the guy previous to you as he's sort of orally reciting it, and you sort of pass it on down the chain. It's like Homer, to use that particular Western example, or of course the Germanic sort of sagas, we can definitely say. But in terms of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey were the original audiobooks, as of course people have pointed out, because they were orally transmitted on down the generations. They had an author, sure, but they sort of were preserved in that particular manner. That's what Smriti is for us. Now, the Puranic texts are Smriti, basically. So they're that sort of, they had authors, they compile mythology, legends, and so on and so forth. They're more recent. They often date from the last sort of, well, not 2,000 years, but around about 500 years either side of 0 AD. To be a bit generous in terms of including the Itihasas, the sort of the histories, might sort of say, the historical epics, we should probably say, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, in that particular dating. The Vedas, by contrast, are well, at least 1,000 years older for the sort of the older bits of the Rig Veda. In fact, some elements of it go back even further, and we can demonstrate in terms of some of the elements of the Shatapada Brahmana, which I've worked with previously. But they actually seem to go all the way back to the Urmat in terms of the actual ritual structures and understandings which are involved in them, which is, of course, why they're of particular interest in the Western reconstructive sphere. It's understandable, therefore, that when people were going around looking at things in the Hindu sphere and went, okay, we want to identify with some of this because it's grand, it's impressive, it's cool. We can clearly see the similarities with the ancestral faiths of Rome and Greece and Northern Europe. It's understandable. They therefore went with the far further back stuff, as opposed to the relatively more recent stuff, insofar as 2,500 years ago is relatively more recent. But you see, this is the thing. The separation between Puranic and Vedic is an entirely false one. Now, Professor Michael Whitser, probably the foremost living authority on Hinduism operating in the West today, great guy in terms of many of his insights, he actually pointed out this. So he said, many of my colleagues, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Many of my colleagues sort of fall into this trap. They're so bewildered by the diversity of the expression of the Hinduism on the subcontinent today that they assume that there's no threads of coterminity with the ancient Vedic past, that it's all sort of elephant-headed deities and monkey gods and things like that, which are obviously irreducibly of the subcontinent, and therefore has nothing in common with those ancient Vedic roots, which don't have these elements in anything like the same prominency. And of course, that the ancient sort of ritual corpus, the Vedas, is not really sort of so much performed or something, and therefore it's a fundamentally different religion, completely different understanding. So you get the idea. This is not the case. Some years ago, to use an example, in the course of my theological work, I'm often sort of traipsing my way through various ancient Vedic hymnals, ancient Vedic rituals, in order to be able to better understand them and then also connect them with the European cognate elements. Some years ago, I remember I spent the day working with one in particular. It was a Marut sort of invocation, if memory serves. I was at my temple that evening, and I couldn't believe my ears because the lines from that invocation were being sung around me. We were singing them. I could sing along. It was an incredible feeling to know that my voice was joining with these voices, which had been carrying this particular set of lines for 3,500 years in an unbroken lineage of tradition. It's an amazing thing. It's an incredible choir. But that's just the thing. That line has remained unadulterated all the way from the Vedic era onwards. In fact, probably right the way back to the Proto-Indo-European Relationship if we go back even further. And it's not just idle lines of scripture. In terms of, Mahashivratri 2 years ago, I spent the week writing something about this figure called the Manu. The Manu is one of the foremost sort of Vedic war gods. Interestingly enough, the name and some of the functional roles are cognate with Minerva, as you probably expect, Proto-Indo-European men, which means sort of mind, spirit, things of that particular nature. It informs in both directions, but we'll cover that possibly a bit later on. When I got to temple that evening, after having completed 36,000 word commentary, 18,000 words of which I've written in the previous sort of 5 hours or thereabouts, we're holding a fervor, I suppose you might sort of say, Manu in a different sense, Furor Poeticus. We wound up sort of in the temple, and once again, I couldn't believe my ears, because what I could now hear was the liturgy from this particular ancient and terrible Vedic rite, as the commentary describes it as, from the Shadapatham Ramana once again, being recited around me. And I could see how the elements of these particular oblations and things were being reflected and carried forth in the observances which were going on in front of me in this temple, carried out by dozens of people. This was the living Indo-European religion. This was the living Vedic faith. Now, once again, what we find, and this is an incredibly important thing for the general sort of subject of discussion we have here today, is the essence has remained true. The essence has remained coherent. The essence has remained vitally there. The expressions have grown outwards into an incredible panoply and diversity. But if you know where and how to look, it all traces itself back to that essence. We can see it. A good example for this would probably be found when it comes to Lord Shiva. Now, you'll often find idiots online insisting that Shiva is a different deity to Rudra, that Shiva is a modern Puranic figure. This is completely false, but it's a very persistent lie for a number of reasons. Even Shiva is non-Indo-European, they often sort of try and assert. We find Rudra held as Shiva in the Vedas. We find the essential characteristics which identify Shiva in modern understanding also present and prominently affixed to Rudra in the Vedas. They're all right there. But because nobody actually bothers to go off and read the Vedas for a number of reasons, this becomes obscurated. And so instead of actually engaging with the truth of the matter, they read Wikipedia. They see this, oh yes, Puranic deity, non-Indo-European, to a guy called Danny Lou often sort of comes up in these sorts of circles. He was a Frenchman and also a charlatan in terms of what it's later turned out about his translations of some of the work in question. He insisted that Shiva was a Dravidian figure. He insisted that Dionysus was a Pelasgian figure and had some very strange thoughts about a sort of a pan-Eurasian sort of pre-Indo-European culture these both came from. Utterly false, but served as narrative to promulgate. Anyway, I've sort of gotten rather sort of off track on that particular front. The general point I'm making is there is no such thing as a hard Puranic and Vedic distinction. Another example which we can use to illustrate this, because I think this is quite handy. In Greek mythology, we have various situations involving Skyfather in pursuit of the mother goddess in animal form. One example of this is Poseidon engaged in pursuit of Demeter Hermes in horse form. Another example is Zeus in pursuit of Leda in pursuit of Nemesis, I should say, in swan form, with the egg that sort of results being presented then to Leda, which of course leads to eventually the Trojan War. But that's another series of myths. I won't go into the full exegesis of this, but suffice to say that it's exactly the same myth as something we find mentioned in the Puranic corpus, wherein Surya, the sun, pursues his wife, Saranyu, once again in animal form. The reason why we can tell this is the same myth is because of some of the progeny in question. So, for example, in that situation of Zeus and Nemesis, the progeny include the horse twins, the Dioscuri, the sons of heaven, sons of Deus, those being Castor and Pollux. That also includes the beautiful solar princess, Helen, who is still being worshipped as a deity in Sparta, at least, even into the classical age, and a number of other coterminities, which, again, you can read my work on it elsewhere. In the Vedic sphere, exactly the same pattern. The Ashvins, the hero horse twins, and of course, Tapati, the beautiful solar princess, other identifying marks, so on and so forth. Except here's the thing. While this myth does occur in the Vedas, it's literally about a single line, maybe half a line, of one hymnal in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, which actually talks about it in the most vague and brief possible details. It's only in the Puranic corpus, in texts that were compiled and composed in the mid sort of centuries of the first millennium AD that the myth in question actually finds its active expression. And that's important because what it indicates is that the mythology in question was active, vital, and living, briefly referenced in the Vedas, but still very much an active thing everybody knew. Why would you reference it in the Vedas anyway? Because those are invocations. They're not there to compile the mythology, just to make reference to it in invocatory use. But it was actively preserved as part of the general cultural sphere until somebody wrote it down thousands of years later, and likely right the way back from the Indo-European Urtimat. So once again, despite the fact that it's later composition and later sort of codification, the essence has remained true all the way from the Urtimat, even in the Puranic sort of sphere. Anyway, I've gotten wildly off, sort of off into the weeds, as it were. So I should bring things back to ritual reconstruction before I sort of leave people disappointed on that particular front. As was mentioned in the introduction to our discussion today, the situation that we have in the European side of things is we often have in the classical sphere mythology, or rather we have collections of mythology done by some good writers, often enhanced in various ways to their particular creative proclivities. For example, in fact, Pausanias himself points this out when he's sort of talking about the myth of the Hydra. He's like, well, obviously, all of these things about sort of multiple heads, etc., getting up to 50 or 100 was a Greek tragedian deciding that he was going to make his story more epic by increasing the number of heads. He's not incorrect. It's just that instead of Pausanias's euhomeric idea of just a very big snake, the actual archaic opposition probably had 3 heads. But that is, well, it's a matter of sort of comparative theological reconstruction. I digress. The point is, the Greek mythology that we have is often somebody attempting to make sense of something without having the full picture. Now, a good example of this, which I often cite, is the mythology around Dionysus, whereby, depending upon which sort of scholar of the classical world you're talking to, in their own words, they acknowledged up to 4 different Dionysuses, some of whom they regarded as, okay, well, this is obviously a local manifestation of the same god, others of whom they weren't so sure about, and others of whom they just went, okay, well, technically people say it is, so we'll just sort of say we acknowledge 4 Dionysuses. They may be the same guy, they may not. You also wind up with these sort of somewhat fragmentary perceptions of, okay, so these Greeks over here know that Dionysus is also Hades. That's a bit strange, but okay, they have their local belief. Now, as it happens, this is actually completely correct. Dionysus is an expression of the sky father deific. But of course, because the reconnection and recombination of Greek mythology with other Greek mythology from down the road has often led to some curious recombinations, this sort of thing has become obscurated. This sort of thing has become forgotten. Another example, once again drawing from Pausanias, is the situation of Zeus Triophthalmos, Zeus the three-eyed one, which of course, there's some interesting points of resonancy with the Hindu sphere right there, understood as Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon being 3 expressions of the same deity, sky father. It makes logical sense, especially when you consider, say, Dis Pater and other such figures in the sort of the broader classical sphere. The reason why I talk about this is because in the Hindu sphere, we have mythology of a similar sort, which talks about, well, particular deific expressions, we may sort of say, as being almost separate figures. So, for example, we might find in some myths, sort of Agni turns up over here and Shiva's over here, and there's some interesting interchange between the 2 figures, regarded as potentially being sort of separate gods in sort of the modern conventional understanding. It's just that we also have in the Hindu theology the other side of things, which points out, no, these are the same deific. Here's the direct chapter and verse citations quite repeatedly saying, yes, Agni is Rudra. Yes, Rudra is Deus Pitar. That's another sort of pet annoyance of mine. People saying Deus Pitar is no longer worshipped. This is completely false. His name is Rudra, and he's one of those prominent deities in the modern Hindu sphere. My point is, we can use those essential sort of behind the scenes, behind the curtain, if you will, underlying connections which are preserved in the Hindu sphere to help us to understand some of the seeming, not necessarily contradictions, but some of the peculiar bits and pieces, the fragmentations which have occurred in the Greek and Nordic mythology. In the Nordic mythology, to sort of head further north, the situation we have is worse than the Greek, because while various of the texts, like sort of large swathes of the Völuspá and sort of the poetic end of things, were indeed preserved from before Christianization, a lot of the stuff that we actually have which talks and explains it, or rather doesn't explain it, was only written down some decades after Christianization of Iceland, in the case of Sturluson, and once it had no longer become, in public terms, private terms is possibly another matter, in public terms, a living religion. This means you get stuff like the ecumenization we see in the Linga saga in terms of Odin being turned into a Trojan warlord, which I often find rather amusing. Because if you think about it, what Sturluson talks about in that particular section is Odin et Co, coming from near the coast of the Black Sea and then spreading up to the north and the northwest. Now, yes, this in fact did happen. It was called the expansion of the Urhimat some 6,000 years ago. It's just that obviously it wasn't the relocation from Troy. So a case of being right for the wrong reasons, might sort of suggest. Anyway, the point is, we have various elements which we can see are talking about ritual. We can tell they're talking about ritual occasionally because they talk, they expressly say, yes, this is a sort of a metaphysical operation which we're doing. When somebody sort of cuts themselves to illuminate their runes with blood, for example, that's a sort of a small scale ritual. But we also have elements whereby we have to infer that a ritual is what's being talked about. Now, the example which I want to use for this, I recently did a half-hour-long thing on this just yesterday, the day before, is what we would call in the Hindu sphere, Shivling Puja. Now, I'll introduce this by showing my Lingam. This is a Shivling, a very small one, but it's, well, we won't go into the full sort of depth of discussion about it. Suffice to say that this particular stone here, which I'll hold up to the camera, is Lord Shiva. Effectively, it's an aniconic representation of Lord Shiva made by him with the red part, which is meteoric iron, being in fact Shakti, his wife. It's both Shiva and Shakti in the one sort of stone. Many lingams aren't both at once. This is not a mother or bundle lingam, so it's particularly special in that regard. Now, the way in which we worship the lingam, there are several, but the primary one involves libations of water, milk, and occasionally panchamrit, which is amrit basically means sort of immortality, elixir of. Panchamrit means use sort of 5 ingredients to basically construct a ritual substitute for it. So the 5 ingredients being ghee, which is clarified butter, curd, so that is unsweetened yogurt, milk, jaggery, which is sugarcane, and honey. So it's an incredibly sweet beverage, so, but I digress. The point is, the Shivling is often said to be Dravidian. It's often said to be non-Indo-European. This is false. We can demonstrate this in a number of ways, one of which is the actual ritual sort of instructions, if you will, in the Linga Purana, directly point out how it's a continuation of the Stamba sort of sacrificial post understanding found in the Vedas. The other way is by looking at some of our comparative Indo-European material from the more sort of Western spheres. Now I'll read out, if I have them, yes, 2 quotes. Now, the first one of these is from a chap by the name of St. Augustine. Many people will be aware of him as a Christian theologian and something of a polemicist when it came to disparaging pagan beliefs for the obvious reasons. Here, he's referencing the work of a Roman polymath historian by the name of Varro, who was writing quite some time before. And it's unfortunate that Varro's own work that he's referencing doesn't survive, so we don't know quite how far he's twisting things. It's about the cult of Libya, which is to say Dionysus, which technically speaking, yes, the Roman authorities did have a bit of a uncomfortable relationship with, because it was perceived as being un-Roman in terms of how wild and excessive it could potentially be. So Libya was a bit of a sanitized version in some regards. Anyway, the Augustine quote: "Among other rites which I am compelled to pass over due to their sheer number, there are certain rites of Libya that Varro says are celebrated at Italian crossroads with such shameful abandon that the private parts of the male are worshipped in the god's honor, and not even in secret out of some deference to modesty, but openly and with wantonness running riot. Yes, indeed, during Libra's festal days, this disgusting member would be exhibited on a wagon with great honor, and carried first around the crossroads in the countryside, and then brought all the way into the city. In the town of Lithuania, they even dedicated a whole month to Liber. And during these days, they all used such disgraceful language until that member had been carried through the forum and come to rest in its own place. Then the most respectable woman, a mother of a family, had to place a garland on said dishonorable member. In this way, supposedly, the god Liber was to be propitiated, so that all would turn out well with the seeds. In this way, the hex needed to be watered off the fields. Now, to briefly add to that, Lingam in Sanskrit is a term with a, as with many words in Sanskrit, a bit of a broad meaning for you. It can mean a sort of a marking, you might sort of say a way of telling something. In particular, it can mean a way of telling gender. In this particular case, the male gender. So yes, you can viably translate lingam as phallus. And in fact, there are some rather overtly phallic lingams out there around the place. Yeah, yes, I'm all the time. I'll finish up soon. Now, this, of course, winds up being something which is utilized to attack Hinduism, both in terms of missionary activity and also in the depths of online discussion when people of some people in the European sphere want to sort of say we're barbaric, uncouth savages, etc. Leaving aside, of course, that the classical religion they're often quite a fan of had herms and other things which had no issue having phallic display as part of ritual levels of understanding. It was quite normal, healthy, we might sort of suggest. The garlanding with flowers, yes, we also do this for the larger linga. If you'll be able to get too many flowers, pop a few dandelions in this one, that's another matter. The thing which we can sort of use Hinduism for, because this is why I'm drawing upon it as a case study, we don't really know very much at all about what's going on with these liberal rites based upon that polemical tirade of St. Augustine. In order to be able to say, okay, so this is plausibly how an Indo-European rite involving such a sort of a phallic representation would work, we have to go, okay, so do we have a cognate understanding elsewhere we can draw on? And as it happens, we do. In this particular case, we can reasonably sure that it's a cognate understanding, not just due to the phallic sort of side of things, but because of the well-known concordancy of Dionysus with Shiva. This is something which the Greeks themselves, obviously Liber being Roman, the Greeks themselves were rather big on. So, for example, after the Macedonians made their way to India, we find in both Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca and Strabo's Geography mention of pillars being found in India where Dionysus had been used in his worship. Because, of course, those pillars are those lingams, are those stamba, etc., as of course discussed. Now, we shall briefly go into the Nordic sphere with this. The Gylfaginning, which is, of course, Sturluson's later compilation and editorializing of various sorts of texts. It is further said that these nuns who dwell by the well of Ur take water of the well every day, and with it that clay which lies about the well, and sprinkle it over the ash, to the end that its limbs shall not wither nor rot, nor for that water is so holy that all things which come here into this well become as white as the film which lies within the eggshell, as is here said, and he quotes the Voluspa. I know an ash standing, called Yggdrasil, a high tree sprinkled with snow-white clay. Thence come the dews. In the dale that fall, it stands evergreen above Urdur's well. And then, of course, he goes back into some editorialization. That dew which falls from it onto the earth is called by the men honeydew, and thereon are bees nourished. Then he talks about some swans, which we'll talk about some other time. Now, restricted to 2 points of interest with regard to this. The first one is that we can actually identify a pretty foundational Indo-European thing going on there in terms of the association of an ash tree with honey. We find this in the Greek sphere when it comes to mele, which of course means honey, and of course basically this effectively the same word means ash, and it turns into terms utilized to mean sphere because that's where you get the good spears from as an ash tree. So Eumeles, the Greek hero, means the guy with the good spear. Now, the association of the ash tree with honey in the form of ash dew or ash sap, might sort of suggest, is actually part of this libation understanding, because what's going on there is the elixir of immortality, what we would call amrut or soma in the Hindu sphere, or ambrosia, or nectar in the sort of the Greek, directly cognate linguistically ambrosia and amber, is being co-expressed in that Völuspá excerpt, and of course the Gylfaginning editorialization. The libations which are being applied to the world tree by the ash nymphs of this white liquid, other translations do in fact have it not as a clay but as a liquid, are, which makes sense because it's coming out of a well, are pretty much cognate, I believe, with the panchamrit, the ritual preparation we use to anoint and carry out the libations for our Shivling association, as we can see here. I will draw it to a close. I have seen that message. In terms of this, therefore, we can use the Hindu understanding of a ritual that's still living today, that we know all the metaphysics for, and the instruction manual, which sort of governs how we're to do it and everything else, to actually resurrect all of these fragmentary traces of ritual, which were found over here in the Western European sphere. We only have the traces, we only have the vague outlines when it comes to the Western European sphere. We can fill these things in, utilizing the DNA drawn from the Eastern side of things. In terms of the resurrection, that's how we have to look at the Hindu sphere with respect of our cousins in the East who kept things alive, whom we're borrowing things from, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians who've managed to keep things alive, and being incredibly gracious that we're able to shelter in their house while we revitalize our own. With that in mind, I think we'll bring things to a close, move on to Q&A.
Thanks very much, Karen. Much appreciate that. Are there any questions? Oh, Michael, you've got your hand up in Amsterdam. Sorry, were you raising your hand or not? Oh, okay. Yeah. So well, if anyone has a question, please raise either the hand icon or just actually raise a hand. What would the interest be on the part of any Indian from the Hindosphere to draw closer to some of the remnants of the European deities?
That's a very good question. It's an interesting one because, of course, if you have the living sort of faith around you where you are, why would you want to go anywhere else? And part of the reason is because there are, I suppose, not sort of an exoticism to it, but there are understandings out there which may be a little sort of more remote when it comes to the actual sort of Indian sphere itself. Partially because we often find more summarized sorry, I'll start again with regard to this explanation. One of my devotees is very big on sort of, she's an Indian Brahmin, as it sort of happens, so an interesting combination for a start. She's very big on Nordic mythology, absolutely loves the stuff, partially because she can clearly identify elements which are perhaps less emphasized when it comes to the sort of civilized grahasta, sort of household side of things, Hindu sort of religion, with the sort of the more sort of outlaw god side of stuff associated with Odin over there in the Nordic sphere. So even though these elements are very much to be found also in the Hindu sphere with various sorts of wandering ascetic bands, the Vracha, etc., she nevertheless finds it both aesthetically resonant and also spiritually resonant to engage with the Nordic side of things. Some of our other associates who are big on the, I suppose, the Indo-European thing from the Indian side of things are doing it because they hold, as we do, a genuine belief in being able to resurrect and revitalize their cousins in the West. They want to be able to help us out just as we really sort of need the help. Others have a more sort of polemical approach. Okay, well, it's striking a blow against sort of the Abrahamic faith, which I don't necessarily agree with, but that's not a matter for another time.
I certainly can understand someone being interested in the parallels in northern myths with those of Indian tradition, but whether it would actually form part of practice is another matter. Here, I mean, I do know some Hindus who are interested in becoming much more aware of the spiritual traditions surrounding the landscape, the rivers and the land, and that seems to me entirely because they wish to engage with the place where they are living, and that makes sense. They're not living in India. They're here, so that is something, that they're not near the Ganga, and and therefore they're near different rivers. So I can understand that. That makes sense. I mean, one of the things. I mean, there were two things I think which I found particularly valuable from the. I just come to you in a minute, Miran. The Hindu sphere is that it gives one a chance to meet people who've been brought up as if we let's say Hinduism is the same as paganism. The two things are the same. One gets the chance to meet people who've been brought up in a tradition of pagan religiosity and lead lives that are quite exemplary and are very impressive in terms of the simplicity and the knowability of their aspirations, and that is something which is really lacking in the European pagan community. That I mean, there aren't neo-pagans. There are hardly any neo-pagans like that one can actually meet. And religion is about meeting people that one thinks are impressive human beings, and that's something that one can get through this through contact with the Hindosphere from people in Europe. The other thing that we lack, I think, is an epic like the Ramayana, where one shows um, how to live a godly life in a human form. Um, the Ramayana is similar to the Odyssey, but it has a deity at the center as opposed to a hero, and people can see his divinity and react accordingly, and that's why the Ramayana has uh, given birth to a continuous worship of Lord Ram, and that is totally alive now. And there's no European text that has had that ability to generate a cult following of the hero. I mean, I don't know of any temples to Odysseus, for instance, but there are obviously so many to Lord Ram. Uh, that those are two points. Before I go on to Miran, any thoughts about that, Cohen?
Uh, well, actually, there's several.
Yeah,
I'll try
sure.
and get through. The first one is the notion of hero cults. Yeah, it is actually a pretty attestable A, classical thing, and also B, it's a Germanic thing. So we wind up with temples to Hercules for obvious reasons. Also, interestingly enough, temples to Aeolus can be found in the classical sphere, despite the fact he's ostensibly rather less divine. In terms of the sort of the Odysseus side of things, while not necessarily deified as far as I'm aware, from the Iliad, Diomedes did wind up explicitly deified or undergoing apotheosis. But also B, I believe, and this is completely, we'll get into this some other time, that the situation,
Pues,
thank you, Sridhar. I believe that Odysseus was actually in some regard a resonancy, if you will, of what we'd also identify with A, Odin, and B, other deities of that particular nature. But LSA, another matter for another time. I do take your point about the living epic sort of element. What we're effectively engaged in, I believe, at this particular juncture in our history, is the writing, the enactment of what will be an epic in 1,000 years' time. If we pull this off, that's the sort of stuff songs should be sung about, if you get my drift.
That's a good point. Good point. Yeah, Miran, please.
um, uh, thank you. Nice to see you again, all of you. I have just some comments, remarks. No, any particular questions? Maybe you can comment my comments. One is that focus on India and Europeans, which means the Hindu cultural hemisphere and the Greco-Roman and Christian and Jewish West, and you jump over Iran, the Persian realm, and also the Russian. Well, one may think about, what's the agenda? Uh, I mean, I'm more interested in the societal and political aspects of how those, you know, realms or deities and I mean, cultural systems or belief systems are used. One is that India has always offered, its services, and the Western culture or political system has always, used those services like pacifism. If you like to practice pacifism, well, welcome to India and their gods. They are harmless, and you can enjoy all that. And Mahatma is always there, and you can, use all that. And then you have the Russians and the Iranians, always the threat, and their deities are never, there's no Russian deities. It's all Iranian, and Zoroaster is also a Russian, and the Russians are discussing, how to reconnect to Zoroaster and Mithraism as this Yule, Yalda in Iran, and all these Mithraic, you know, belief systems, which are very old, as much old as the Indian, but so much, suppressed, especially in the Roman, Greek Roman, system. Now, what I'm trying to say is that this kind of discussion must, aim on some kind of reintegration of the belief systems and see similarities. Of course, one would, I mean, one strategy,
Should I let Corinne answer that? This idea of
okay,
yeah,
okay,
because I think you
I can
yeah
go on. Thank you,
yeah
thank you. How about that? Do you have, Kervin,
Yeah,
any
of course.
thoughts about, some kind of a coherent linking of the whole spectra and not only, separate
Of course.
systems?
yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, okay, so the first thing to say is that this is the first time I've ever heard Hindu gods described as harmless. But in terms of what you're getting across there, there's something I absolutely agree with in terms of it being a broad spectrum, and often we find that various things can fall through the cracks. Now, I didn't intend to try and erase anybody's heritage. As far as a focus upon the classical sphere and the Hindu sphere goes, yes, that's partially because those are the best tested spheres that we have. It's where we've got the most to work with. I've also pointedly in the course of the discussion tried to integrate Nordic elements, partially because of my own ancestry, but also partially because this is a Blót which we're ostensibly commenting for. But in terms of those points in the middle, you're absolutely correct. Not enough attention gets given to those other less tested cultures. And when I say less tested, I mostly mean the Slavic sphere. I'm quite aware of the Iranian sphere being quite different in that regard. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, the issue when it comes to Slavic reconstructionism, I run a research institute, Arya Akasha, which I probably should have mentioned a lot earlier. So if you're interested in sort of my broader thoughts on all of this, you can find us at aryaakasha.com. That's my prop for this today.
It's on the notice I sent to everyone here, so everyone should be aware of that, Corinne. And yeah.
Excellent. But in terms of some of your questions around how Slavic religion and how sort of Iranic sort of Indo-European religion sort of fits into it, we get into in quite some depth and detail an array of those questions there. So we're not ignorant of it. We have considered it. And you're quite right. We could have done a better job of integrating it into this morning's discussion. Of course, there's many things which got left on the cutting room floor, probably not enough in terms of, how long it went on for, but I digress. The first problem that we have in terms of the Russian side of things is that there's so little material to actually work with. Basically, all that we have are secondary sources, often from missionaries or other people who didn't know quite what they were looking at, occasionally reinterpreted in rather radical ways. So, for example, I'm talking about the figure of Svarog. The main source we have talking about it is a document which got sort of translated both culturally and sort of linguistically into, mythic terms of ancient Egypt, and then sort of presented by a Christian monk. So we have very little idea as to how much authenticity is present in this document, which talks about this Svarog figure. We can deploy other things from sort of the broader Indo-European sphere to make sense of it. Like, for example, Svarog is spoken of as being kind of like Hephaestus, so there's obviously a forge god element going on. And we can deploy the linguistics for Svarog to see, sort of either heavenly ruler or sovereign, effectively, in terms of the connotation, to start fleshing out some of the elements. But there's just simply not enough to really go on to actually have a sort of a freestanding thing when it comes to that particular deific. However, having said that, in terms of the Balto-Slavic sphere, so where the Slavic sphere meets the Baltic one, we are on rather better and surer footing. So we do have a certain level of preservation in the folklore. of certain things, which again, we can match up and marry up with stuff from elsewhere in the sphere. For example, the priests of Veles putting out an eye, which should remind you of something. But in terms of in terms of the Baltic sphere, it gets rather sort of problematic, because the extermination of that faith being carried out by the Crusaders in sort of the last millennium means that the folkloric elements are rather fragmented and are often subject to people in the 1800s who are collecting them having their own particular ideas about what things should look like, and therefore not necessarily being authentic. Now, to bring this over to the Iranic area, and I do apologize for not talking more about the Iranic sort of area of things, because you're quite right, it often does wind up being sort of maligned, especially in the modern day. Although I do slightly disagree in terms of India always being sort of the peaceful, amenable one, because if you look at the actual British reporting prior to sort of the Gandhi era of things, you find various comments about, sort of thuggy cultists and violent uprisings and whole of Calcutta, and of course Shivaji, as was mentioned earlier, being one of the few people to fight the British Navy on the sea and win. But I digress. In terms of the Iranic sort of side of things, there are two dimensions which must be considered, which do sort of cross over. The first one, which you've sort of alluded to, is the Zoroastrian sort of sphere. That gets a lot of attention because, yes, technically speaking, it is a still living religion. It's small, but it's still there. The Parsi community in India is one obvious example. However, the broader sphere, and to my mind, the more interesting and useful, is actually that broader Iranic sphere, which wasn't really Zoroastrian, or at least, while it may have been influenced by it from time to time, often had some very different beliefs in particular regards. I've been writing quite extensively about this in recent weeks when it comes to Sogdian and, of course, Scythian mythology and religion. This is incredibly useful for us because to sort of take a brief tour through several thousand years worth of history, as I'm often prone to do, the Proto-Indo-European Urtimat is quite likely, as we all know, on the Pontic steppe, which is, sort of that area sort of northeast of the Black Sea, which is basically Scythia. The Scythians, per reconstructive analysis of what we've got from Herodotus and other sources, appear to have been speaking sort of an Iranic language. They appear to have had basically that Iranic sort of sphere beliefs. What happened is, after the Urtimat and sort of the diffusion out in multiple directions, you wind up with the people who went east, encountering obviously first the Court of Ware culture, and then of course after that they become what's known as the Andronova and Satashta cultural horizons. What we wind up with is the preservation in the Vedas of that Andronova religion, and also in terms of the Scythian sphere, that Andronova religion likewise. The issue that we have when it comes to Zoroastrianism and its integration is that some elements definitely are also a carrying forward, or more likely a reintegration of those Andronova bits and pieces. We can tell this because there are certain hymnals which align reasonably well with Vedic hymnals, etc. The trouble is that Zoroaster was a heretic, a religious reformer, who pointedly tried to literally demonize the preceding religion. You find this with the inversion that takes place, as of course you know, with basically Deva becomes Deva, which means some demon, etc. We find that Manu figure I briefly spoke about becoming Angra Manu. We find Indra amongst the lists of the demons, also Sarva, which is to say Shiva, the archer, and so on and so forth. So there's this immense problem when it comes to taking Zoroastrian texts at face value, especially because a lot of the time what we find, there's basically three layers to the more archaic Zoroastrian corpus. There's the stuff Zoroaster himself was promulgating, which effectively is, I'm not going to say atheistic, but it doesn't really have much of a place for gods in the conventional Indo-European sense. In fact, Ahura Mazda, you could viably translate as just sort of generally great, powerful wisdom. It's almost Buddhist in that sort of regard. What you find later on, so basically in the Yashts, which dates to after Zoroaster's death, by the priesthood who came along afterwards, is the slow reintegration of first the acceptable, Indo-Iranian sort of forms of these deities. So you get particular, you mentioned Mithra as one particular example, being brought in as sort of like, okay, well, these are okay, we can worship them, despite the fact that they would have been devas, if you will, that we can actually sort of engage in cultic practices with them. Although the interesting thing there is what we tend to find is that elements which are associated with other gods, which were demonized, get sort of reassigned. So, for example, Mithra in the Iranic, well, the Persian understanding, is wielding a Vajra, that is to say, a Vajra, something which ordinarily Indra would be doing. You see how this sort of works together. What then happens is a third layer of integration after that, of figures that should have been properly sort of deivic or demonic, but which could not be suppressed and therefore were integrated. Now, the grand example for this is Anahita, which we would understand in the Vedic sphere as Devi, Saraswati, figures of that particular nature. We actually find direct mention in the Yashva question for Anahita even still having both, sort of Ahuric, I should say, Ahuric and Devic cults. And oh no, don't go anywhere near the Devic cults because so they conduct rites after nightfall, all sorts of bits and pieces like that, which indicates there was still this this living Devic, i.e., authentic in this particular regard, presentation. To briefly jump back a bit, in terms of the Turanian sort of situation, which the Zoroastrians talk about and feel greatly under threat from, that's the authentic Iranic belief, as carried forth by the Scythians in Gorgistan and so on and so forth. And they are, of course, attacked as being Deva worshippers. And as we've demonstrated, they have an Indra, they have the Nasachas, they have this Thara figure, and so on and so forth. They have the Anahita, they have all of this authentic Indo-European belief. The trouble is they're not a very literate culture, so all that we really know about them at that far back point in time is what their enemies were writing about when it came to them. Now, a good example of why this is very worrisome to actually sort of draw from directly is the concept of Vipra. Now, my accenting on basically everything is terrible, so this probably won't be pronounced in the correct Old Western. But in Sanskrit, we would know it as Vipra. It's cognate with Latin vibro, which means to vibrate. In Sanskrit, this Vip and Vipra, it means divine inspiration, furor, whether of Poeticus or possibly Teutonicus, but the same energy, same god, Odin, of course, in the sort of the European understanding, divine inspiration, which causes you sort of to seem to be radiant, to be sort of vibrating with the energy that is within you. It's a grand and a positive thing. It is the quality that makes a kavi, which is also turns up in the Western, a sort of a poet, a sort of a priest ruler, able to do what he does. Why he's a seer? It's bestowed by the goddess. In Zoroastrianism, by contrast, because they were demonizing not only the gods, but also the priests of the old religion, it gets turned into a term for the receptive role in homosexual conduct. Now, this, of course, is basically a punishable by death offense in the Zoroastrian legal corpus. So as you can see, there's an Orwellian newspeak that's taken place here to take something that's quite good and positive in the entire rest of the Indo-European sphere and say, no, this is evil, this is homosexual, this, the people who practice this should be put to death, you should go nowhere near these people, and so on and so forth. So to bring all these things into sort of a summary element, yes, there are elements in the Zoroastrian corpus that can be useful for what we're actually sort of talking about with this broad Indo-European thing. However, a lot of those are the later ones, and more especially they're the ones which are found more authentically preserved with the other Iranic peoples who weren't part of the Zoroastrian sort of core cultural sphere. For example, when it comes to the Sogdian sphere, we have these wonderful paintings and murals out at Penjaken in Tajikistan, which feature this deific Nana, which is quite so useful, and this figure called Veshparkara, which means Vayu, the high working, which is reasonably cognate with Shiva in terms of the iconography, etc., which help us to understand this broad sphere and are very, very cool to look at even beyond that. So we do make quite a point in my work elsewhere of integrating these Scythian elements, these Sogdian elements, these broader Iranic sphere elements, and trying not to ignore them, while also being able to bring forth some of these Slavic elements, which are also, as you pointed out, often in direct connection with these Iranic sphere elements as well. Just because I didn't mention the talk today doesn't mean they don't get any look. So thank you very much for raising that.
Great, thanks for that very, very full response, Cohen. Michael in Amsterdam, I'm sure you've got some thoughts about this matter, having spent quite a long time in India. Yeah, if you could unmute, please. Great.
I mean, I really don't know what to say.
Oh.
I mean, so much of it is interpretation. It's been my study as well, and I, of course, interpreted things differently than Kerwin has in many extents. I agree with what he says about the Iranian situation. I do question the fact that the whole Vedic Puranic thing is as much of a continuum as you claim. I mean, you can say that, but you didn't really establish actual reasons or even kind of quasi proofs to be able to put a handle on it. Cultures change, and gods change, and deities change. They merge with one another. They split apart. Probably the most obvious example would be Jupiter, Zeus, as both thunder and the sky, whereas in the other traditions, that those two functions are become separate deities. That's just one example. But even in the Rig Veda itself, you see change, and you see from the oldest portions of the Rig, probably the fourth mandala and fourth, fifth, and I think seventh, maybe, or the sixth, maybe it's the sixth, are different from your more speculative hymns of the 10th mandala. So there's I think much more change, which I think has to be worked into trying to understand what Indo-European spirituality is. And I mean, I'm fascinated with the whole subcontinent and its spirituality, but I don't necessarily see that as really representative Indo-European itself. It's another derivative, a major expression. We can learn much from it, and I think I have by going to India as much as I did. But I think there's more complexity. It's wonderful if you can put it all together, but at the same time you want to convince people of that. And if you're just making statements and declarations, that doesn't necessarily convince others. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, obviously this is a complex matter, and I mean I think one of the reasons I invited Kerr in to the MOOC, because I'm very interested in the possibilities for our practical life. I think rather than to have to open up the almost bottomless pit of speculation into mythic nuances and transformations. I think in relation to the future, what is likely to happen, or not, given the compromised nature of the Western heritage, is for instance, I mean, I could ask this to you, Co, and also to you, Michael, whether some kind of syncretism may well take place over the next 100 years, if it's possible to speculate upon that there will be certain almost like on your altar at home in London, there are both deities of Indian origin and European origin. Is that a symbol for what is likely to actually take place? I mean, perhaps, please, I mean, Corinne, what's your thoughts about that? Do you think in Europe we will have that there will there in the future maybe mandis when there will be both European and Vedic deities, murtis, side by side?
Well, I mean, the future is the past, as we all know. And if we go back to the situation in, say, Gandhara about 2,000 years ago, we frequently find directly, crossover, if you will, Hellenic and Hindu religion. There's some wonderful coins, for example, which feature Athena wielding a thunderbolt, funnily enough, riding in a quadriga, which is pretty much what we should expect, except for the fact the quadriga is being pulled by elephants, which of course is rather subcontinental. Now, in terms of the, I don't like to call it syncretic, because syncretic implies to me putting together stuff that is unlike. So if, for example, I was going along and say integrating, say, ancient Egyptian or Sumerian elements into things, that would be syncretism, and some people do that for some strange reason. But in terms of the way we view it as putting back together things which are alike, as revealing the sort of the underlying already existing coterminity rather than putting things together. But I appreciate, with deference to Mr. York's point, that he, well, we should probably explain this rather better, or at least I should. I'd like to get into that actually, but in terms of your sort of the question around sort of combined faith elements, it is something which already occurs. So in terms of the Lithuanian Baltic revival, you'll often find that end of things actively collaborating and cooperating with their local Hindu community, sort of joint worship, etc. I don't see any reason why it would be impossible to have a similar understanding when it comes to the the Indo and the European, or for that matter, the sort of the broader Iranic or other cultures that may be relevant, in an active integration in that particular manner. In fact, right at the moment, because it's rather difficult to source various things with lockdowns and pandemic bits and pieces, I'm in the process of carving some well, I suppose Murtis for home worship, which are actually directly integrating some Germanic elements and also some Hindu elements into the sort of the single sorts of figures. So more on that at some point in the future.
Oh, so I mean, you're actually that is evidence that such a process is happening to some extent, within your practice.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty orthodox for the most part, but in terms of the iconographic representation, it did seem a logical thing to do, especially with regard to some of the rune work, which, well, I think I've shown you some of the examples, but more upon that at some other time.
Yeah.
In terms of Mr. York's point, because there are some very legitimate criticisms which have been raised there, the first thing I'd like to emphasize is that I was given an hour. Now, I went over that, and I'm sorry for anybody who felt that it was too long, but to actually sort of deeply plumb the development of Vedic and Puranic sort of religion would take not just an hour, but lifetimes. You're quite correct that I could have done a better job at actually sort of fishing out examples, other than sort of picking out particular rituals, particular verses, and particular deities that have some coterminity between the then and the now. You're quite correct. However, and we can have further discussion upon that, or I could direct you to my previous works on the subject. However, in terms of some further examples to sort of elucidate some of the transition, if you will, the figure of Hanuman. Now, Hanuman, as you know, monkey god, so on and so forth. People would often say this is a irreducibly sort of Puranic figure, except for the fact that we find in Arvi 1086 direct statement for a monkey deific, who is ritually equivalent to Lord Indra. It's directly there. The reason why this is relevant for us here is because if we consider Hanuman, Hanuman is Bajrangi, whereas of course you see Vajra, Bajrangi, the direct sort of relationship there. Hanuman is the son of the Sky Father, which is to say a son of Shiva in some traditions of the text, or a son of Vayu in other sort of recensions. It's basically the same figure, especially because of the Shatapatha Brahmana establishes the direct sort of concordancy between the two. We find various elements in the iconography, the Gada, which is sort of wielding, and the mythology, which directly marry up with what we find for the Indo-European striker/thunderer deific found elsewhere in the Indo-European world. Now, this striker/thunderer deific, as of course you're aware, Indra in the sort of the Vedic expression is the most prominent, Thor being, of course, in the Nordic, and both Heracles and Perseus when we encounter him in the Greek sphere. Now, to pick up upon that theme via Perseus, the situation we have via Perseus is, I suppose you might sort of say, origin mythology, is that he's cast upon the seas in a chest in order sort of to grow up somewhere farther away after some interesting business involving his mother and an invocation of the Sky Father to sort of turn up for the conception. We find exactly the same theme being repeated when it comes to the mythic genesis of Krishna, and also the mythic genesis of Karna, which I've written various sorts of bits and pieces about, both figures which wind up being quite concordant in terms of various of their mythic deeds. For example, Krishna winds up subduing a serpent of the waters, as we can tell, wielding that Gada, as you probably expect, and other bits and pieces of that nature. Karna, meanwhile, is literally wielding an Indra-given astra, and has other features we've discussed it at some sort of elsewhere. So as you can see, the underlying structure of various of these myths, underlying points of the theology, wind up resonating, even though some of the expressions may have changed or weakened, possibly because of localization, you might sort of suggest. But that's another sort of set of matters for another time. In terms of, it also crops up with regard to Indra, and I forget which fourth mandala hymnal, but the point is the aquatic sort of dispersion thing is there. In terms of something you said about the Sky Father deific, Jupiter/Zeus, now this is going to be one of those areas I suspect we're going to disagree, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in terms of this idea of a separation between sky and thunder, it's an artificial separation. We can demonstrate this quite easily. Odin, for example, in the Nordic sphere, has a literal theonym of thunderer. It's right there. In terms of Dionysus is repeatedly referred to in the Vedas as thundering. We have Rudra, again, according to the Rig Veda, being Deus Pitara, wielding a Vajra himself. It's a very prominent and continuous identification. The other element which you're perhaps needing to refer to was the confrontation with a draconic foe, a serpent. In the case of the Greek sphere, we have Zeus contra Typhon. Except the situation is that while it is very tempting to link this directly with the sort of the chaos camp motif we're all familiar with, of the striker / thunderer fighting the serpent of the waters. It's actually something which is like father, like son. So just as Zeus fights Typhon, so too does Heracles fight the Hydra. In terms which, of course, we can directly identify with the combat of Indra contra Vritra, due to the salient role of Lakshdevi, that is to say Athena, and also the situation involving, now what's the guy's name? Trita Aptiya, which appears to correlate reasonably well with Aeolus' role in that combat versus the Hydra, but I digress. What I had meant to say is that when we consider the situation of this combat against the serpent, which the father sort of takes place in, we have the Vedic evidence of it being, as I say, like father, like son. When we consider Brihaspati fighting Bala, a situation which directly maps onto an account in the Linga saga for a deed of Odin, which likewise, sorry about burping there, which likewise, with regard to the deed of Brihaspati, involves cleaving apart the earth in order utilizing the power of prayer or Godra and the sort of the Nordic corpus in order to reveal the stolen wealth of cows, sort of, as of course is the objective of various of these sorts of combats. So while it is often presumed that the situation of Zeus and Jupiter has represented a hybridization, if you will, or a development of the sort of the Sky Father to take in this thunderer sort of role, my contention is that if we actually go by the evidence which we find in the sort of the Vedic corpus, the Nordic corpus, so on and so forth, comparative analysis demonstrates quite strongly that the thundering side to the Sky Father has always been there. And that by contrast, what we actually see with the classical side of things, which tends to form everybody's sort of baseline perspective, the quasi-ehumerization of Heracles to go from sort of a more divine figure wielding a sort of divinely empowered sort of Vajra-style thunderbolt through to wielding a club is actually, as I say, an ehumerization, something which has been reduced. Although, interestingly enough, in terms of iconographic saliency, the most archaic depictions of Hercules which we actually have to hand are ones which feature him wielding a harpe, which is a sort of a curved sickle-style sword. A harpe, which in terms of Perseus' wielding of it, I'll have to check to make sure it's the same quality, but it's basically referred to as being adamantine, which is to say unbreakable, and exactly the sort of thing we'd expect with regard to the Vajra, which turns up in the sort of the Eastern sphere. It becomes later on reduced in the case of Hercules down to that sort of that bough of a tree, the more sort of rustic club which he sort of is equipped with. We can similarly suggest the arrows of fire which are used in some particular presentations of the Hydra slaying probably correlate with the description that we find in the Vedas for Indra's Vajra being utilized as an arrow, which has this sort of luminous and burning sort of quality to it. So I just wanted to pick up in terms of that notion of a separation or a development. You're quite right that things can develop and change. And the interesting question is which one of those are human happenstance versus intended divinely guided expansion. But in terms of a final sort of point in all of this, you're quite right further that when it comes to speaking about Indo-European religion, there's often two different understandings to it, which are somewhat coterminous. The first one is Proto-Indo-European religion, the idea that we can basically, by looking at the Vedas or looking at modern Hinduism, get a good sense of what was going on the Iliad. Now, to a point, that is not necessarily incorrect. However, that point is not necessarily all that far, and it does require being able to see with special eyes, and of course, the broad cluster and constellation of the entire Indo-European sphere to adequately confirm things. Like, for example, that Manu and Minerva situation I briefly mentioned in the course of the chat. However, in terms of Indo-European in its second sense, this modern sense, well, I suppose it's modern, the idea that it's basically a this broad continuum of peoples who have this common I was going to say DNA, but well, that's literally the case. So I also mean sort of the cultural and religious DNA. That's a different dimension. We can say that Hinduism is an Indo-European religion in exactly the same way that we could say that Nordic religion was an Indo-European religion, or that Greek religion was an Indo-European religion. All of them went down specific developmental paths, of course, but that does not vitiate the essential coterminity and coherency of the connections between them. I just wanted to make that particular point.
Oh, thank
let me just say that they're not Indo-European religions; they're Indo-European derivatives, and I agree with much of what you're saying. But at the same time, going back to the Stead's question about syncretism, I don't think the future is a syncretic put together of these different religions. What we're really looking at, when most of the pagan religions, at least in Europe and America, whether you're Celtic or heathen or Greek or Latin, Roman, one goes back looking for the earliest understandings of pantheonic configurations or the deities and so forth. If you're talking about Indo-European, then we're actually looking at what were the prototypic figures from which these various figures then emerged in Greek, for Romans, for the Nordics, for the Vedics, and so forth. But so it's not a syncretic thing. It's going back into the past and seeing what the proto figures are. And it seems, in my understanding, they're very, very much connected with elements of nature. The oldest figures are basically personifications of natural elements, the sun, the moon, the earth, the sky, and so forth. So that's where I see the future, is reconnecting with the roots of our Indo-European heritages in a way that impacts and allows us to appreciate the world and nature and the importance of reestablishing the natural balance of the earth. Put it that way.
I like that. Now, there's a number of things I'd like to say about that, of course, Sam, just before we sort of, the first thing is, I completely agree with the idea of the Indo-European religious spectrum enabling one to localize oneself within the world. In fact, loka in Sanskrit, you probably know, means sort of world, plane, so on and so forth. We're going to disagree about the extent to which sort of personified natural forces is salient. I don't disagree, obviously, with the strong saliency of natural forces, just with the fact that this occasionally can wind up being taken in a reductionist and atheistic manner to basically mean, okay, well, it's all just symbolic. We're just talking about forces of nature, not anything with its own sort of entityness to it. But that's possibly another matter for another time. What I would pick up upon to sort of start in reverse, that sense of engagement with the environment. You're absolutely correct. It's absolutely vital. Now, an interesting development in New Zealand law, which it's not necessarily Indo-European, although the British common law is of course involved. We basically have a system here whereby we integrate Maori elements both into our jurisprudence and other elements of governance. This has led to a situation whereby the Wanganui River, a particular river which had some pollution problems, was granted a few years ago legal personhood because, of course, the tribe in question living along it, claimed descent from it, claimed it was a relative. Cool, good, I like it. A few years before that, there was actually another situation of a taniwha, which is kind of like an ancestral dragon spirit thing. We had to build a roadway around its swamp rather than going through the swamp because the taniwha, well, it won a court case. Again, very cool, I like it. In Iceland, you find similar developments. Now, in India, there's recently been cases whereby I forget which river it was, but it was a similar case. The river was granted legal protection because it was granted legal personhood. And as I've always said, if we're going to go around granting corporations personhood, why not start with things which A, actually exist and which are B, useful, like rivers? Yeah. The fact that the anchor for this legal personhood was the divinity of the river, the fact there was a river goddess that could be identified, is a useful sort of bridging point to immanentizing out into the world around us, something which has a lot more legal heft in these particular day and ages than the proper and appropriate customs, you may sort of say. But you're quite right in terms of seeing ourselves in connection with the world rather than apart from it, or as some Lockean sort of developments of Christianity would have, not as wise stewards of the world, but sort of the masters of it in dominion. But in terms of this notion of natural phenomena, now, I ran a series on our site 2 years ago. It's an ongoing series. It's called Sons of the Sun. The reason why it's called that is because, as you'll be aware, the first man in Hindu understanding is Manu. We can find in sort of Tacitus's Germania the recollection of a figure called Manus, who's the son of Twister. So obviously this notion of man, the first man being called man, is well, it's quite ancient indeed. Romulus is another expression of the same typology, but I digress. This guy in the Vedic understanding is literally the son of Surya Vivasa, the Wide Shining. And so with deference to our Iranian associates, I apologize if he's not Iranian, but anyway, they have a similar understanding when it comes to their sort of pantheonic understanding, as I've mentioned elsewhere. The fact that one can talk about oneself in connection with the natural world as being a son of the sun, I don't think it's vitiated by also having that sun being understood in deific terms. In fact, for many people, whether we want to agree to disagree about it being a symbolic understanding or not, I think it's strengthened by the fact that you can have these personified ways of engaging with the deities in question. It's just that I happen to genuinely believe that, yes, the personification element is accurate, whereas others, I don't mean to characterize views inaccurately if I have. Others may potentially disagree and go, well, it's a symbolic personification and points to that particular sort of nature. Now, to go further into this notion of going back into the past, you are completely correct when it comes to the desirability of going back as far as possible. That's one of the reasons why I like the Hindu sphere, because as I may have mentioned, it's all there. We can go back. We can actually engage with the most archaic layer, and also behind these things being actively utilized around us. One, I'm having some rites done at this particular juncture for reasons I won't go into, but they're quite interesting. But the rites in question are Rudra rites. They're quite sort of well, involved rites, we should say. These rites are, of course, from the Shatapada Brahmana and making active utilization of stuff from so the earlier Vedas, the Rig Veda, I think the Yajur Veda, and so on and so forth. I'm not performing these rites because I'm not qualified to, one day maybe. So it's very handy to have that priesthood around who actually can sort of bring out and monetize the past into our sort of our present in a particular sort of regard. The issue that we have in terms of religious reconstruction for these other sorts of spheres is we have escalatingly little attestation for the more archaic end of things the further back you go. Like in terms of, say, linear B texts for the Greek mythology and religion, you're completely correct that we can find some very, very interesting things by going that far back and then seeing how things have possibly sort of developed and sort of become reshaped. This is actually how I tend to view a lot of, how would you say, Greek religion. So, for example, talking about the figure of Poseidon, I've said earlier in this particular piece that per Pausanias, we can identify Poseidon as a sky father explicit that particular minor sort of citation and a travel log of all things. In terms of the identification of the one-axe figure that's sort of mentioned in linear B sort of Mycenaean texts, yes, we can also identify the sort of the Poseidon sort of saliencies. It reinforces the notions you put across that the deific complex in question, we can trace back this far later prominent expression of Poseidon backwards to this original sort of coherency and put that back together where it is supposed to be. The issue is when it comes to actually engaging with this this Poseidon figure, this one-axe figure, or this Dionysus figure, we have, as I say, less ability to do so precisely because the stuff that we have talking about ritual sort of details tends to be far later, once these things are no longer secrets or no longer sort of so actively engaged with, and therefore rather fragmentary in that regard. That's where it comes in, this syncretic notion. Now, one point I would like to sort of raise on that is, I am a simple man. I'm happy in the Hindu sphere. We have everything that we need, broadly speaking. I don't see a need to sort of, well, an active need for experimental purposes is another matter, but a hugely active need to start coloring outside the lines and going out and trying to reconstruct, for my own use anyway, sort of Greek or Nordic liturgy, etc. For other people, however, who need or feel a need to engage with it, that's completely, I completely get where they're coming from. That's why we're doing it. But in terms of sort of the risks of that, to further explicate upon it, we do find some potential difficulties in engaging in that syncretic behavior. So, for example, if we went back to a rather archaic Greek sort of religious texts, we'd find things about sacrificing cows. If you try to do that in a Hindu context, you probably find that you were the one on the altar, depending upon sort of how agamic things might sort of get if you get drift. So you're completely correct to draw those hard lines of caution, if you will, about going too far in a syncretic sort of direction, which can lead to actual and important points of distinction being overlooked in favor of sort of the over-enthusiasm for putting things back together. But at the same time, unfortunate as it is, if we are to actually engage with these most archaic end of things, the only way that we can really do it, due to the paucity of material in various of these more sort of archaic spheres, is by taking a look at the broad Indo-European spectrum, tracing things back to their common sort of origin point via inference rather than necessarily direct textual attestation. And in terms of guiding this inference, making significant use out of the elements which we find when it comes to sort of the archaic Vedic texts and so on and so forth.
Thank you. I'd like to, I mean, we're coming to the end, and I'd like to ask a few other people. I'd like to come to AJ in a second, but Michael in Cologne, you've got your...
Yes, I would. Yes, thank you. That was very, very scholarly and as such extremely impressive. I feel, though, that from what I understood from Stead's invitation, that there was a a notion that there should be a sort of a practical or a needful perspective. And perhaps that got a little bit lost, if I may say so, through all the detail, which was immense and very impressive. And for me, relating a little bit to what Michael York said, I would understand a connection between Hinduism or Hindu religions and the Indo-European or the pagan religions being exactly this, a direct reference to nature, and the nature being a phenomenon of recycling, of recurrence, cyclical religions, whereas the Abrahamic religions are notoriously religions which have a beginning and an end. And as I see it, we are confronted with a scientific challenge today. I'm not going to go into the politics of it, the details. I think we all know what I'm talking about, which terrifyingly wishes to replace, and is terrifyingly far in succeeding in doing so, human beings with planned robots that have nothing to do with the cycle of nature at all, that have their beginning and their end. And that therefore the resistance or the necessity is for religions to come together that have their origins in this idea of the eternal rebirth. And that, I think, is the really important point. And I'm not too bothered about the details of which God is connected with which God. And I think that we shouldn't lose the importance of that. That would be my point.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah, sorry, Corinne. Yeah, sorry.
Well, good. Now, okay, the first thing to say is mea culpa. I got rather sort of not necessarily carried away, but a bunch of points about the how to look at things so much that I stopped. Well, I have in my notes various points for this conversation around what was actually supposed to be there about ritual reconstruction, etc., that possibly be more on the practical side of things. So we'll briefly delve into those now to sort of answer your question. However, we'll start with well, I'm not sure it's a political side of things, but the robotic sort of point, because
yeah, can I just say, AJ's got to go very, very shortly. So, AJ, you've got to go in about 5 minutes, have you?
Well, I just want to be brief. I'll make an observation and see what the speaker, how the speaker would respond to this analogy. Now, many of you who know me already know I'm an evolutionary scientist, so I tend to think in those terms. And I just want to tell like a kind of analogy and tell me what you guys think of this. There's an idea right now, since we've been able to salvage a goodly portion of the genome of the woolly mammoth, to try to clone a woolly mammoth and have, be able to restore the species. Now, I think that would be a great idea, except a lot of people are skeptical of the procedure that they have in mind. Because even though we got a bunch of woolly mammoth genome, we don't have all of it. So the idea was to splice it into the DNA of a modern elephant, so that you'd have mostly elephant DNA with what we know of the woolly mammoth DNA, create an egg cell that can be implanted into the uterus of an elephant. This female elephant, modern elephant, would give birth to this purported woolly mammoth. It seems to me that since, to try to spell out the analogy for you, our information on the traditional religions of Europe are fragmentary, right? That your proposal, Mr. Rawlinson, is to try to splice it with religions that have remained more intact, that come from the same common ancestor. But then the skepticism, if you accept that analogy, and I think some people express the skepticism in different words without so much genetics, right? But that you have to understand that's the way I think, right? Will that actually be a woolly mammoth? There's been so many thousands of years. Proto-Indo-European expansions were started in 3000 BC. And the people migrated away from each other, not to communicate again until just recently. So they've evolved apart. They've distanced themselves. Although I agree with you that it is very clear the common ancestry is unmistakable. I believe you used the word cognates, I don't know that word, but I consider them homologies and evolutionary theory. are unmistakable. However, there are differences, and how do we know how much of this new creature will actually be elephant and not mammoth? First of all, do you accept the analogy? And if so, can you try to comment on the concern?
Yeah, that's actually remarkably close to the analogy I meant to use in talking about the ritual reconstruction thing in terms of DNA splicing from the one end to the other. Now, the way to approach this issue, I suspect, is, well, obviously, of course, epistemologically, but in terms of gods, now I appreciate this may be a point of distinction between the way I believe about things, the way some others here may believe about things. We believe the gods to be real. We believe that the gods of the Proto-Indo-Europeans were carried with those people as they expanded to the east, west, north, south, so on and so forth. And there was no ship of Theseus situation whereby they somehow wound up being replaced by some other figure that just happened to be suspiciously similar in various sorts of regards at their destination or along the way. So if the gods over in the east are the same as the gods over in the west, we are therefore operating in a metaphysical paradigm whereby various mechanisms to engage with those gods should still be fundamentally valid, viable, and we should similarly be able to identify coherent cognate ways to do it. Now, you're quite correct when it comes to the fact that some of the expression of these is by necessity going to differ between the spheres which we have. I've identified a few examples of that, one of which being we don't really sort of sacrifice cows much in the Hindu sphere for obvious reasons. What is necessary is rather in-depth theological examination, which of course I do in my spare time and of course my non-spare time, to try and understand some of these rules so that we may then be able to appreciate which ones are applicable to which situation, and then how we're able to sort of reconstruct the appropriate rules for the appropriate other sphere. Some of these rules, paradigms, perspectives are the result of happenstance, corruption, text being lost, etc., so on and so forth. Others, we suspect, are possibly the result of divinity deciding, well, we'd like this particular people to grow in this particular way, so therefore we'll tweak the appropriate way of engaging in this particular regard. Or maybe it's the result of local and natural things being different in one environment versus another. So, for example, well, there are elephants in India. There aren't really that many elephants in Northern Europe unless you go back reasonably far and you possibly have a woolly mammoth. But that, of course, is bringing things cyclical in a different sort of way. Now, the fundamental question we have in terms of engaging with the gods via ritual sort of piety and enactment, which does come to this other sphere I meant to talk about, is quite a simple one. Why are we doing it? The answer to that is, again, simple. It's because it pleases the gods. It's what we're supposed to be doing. Fundamentally, it works. In terms of the Hindu sphere elements, that's one of our overabiding considerations, is the fact that it does tend to work. I mean, my personal experience obviously is not necessarily to be taken sort of hard evidence, although I would adduce that the plural of anecdote can indeed be data. But in terms of sort of these things that work, if they work over here, understanding why and how they work to be then able to apply them over here in the sort of the westerly sphere makes logical sense. The issue that we encounter is how far we can, if you like, diverge from simply transplanting into this sort of this investiture sort of paradigm. So instead of people in Northern Europe becoming Hindus and carrying out Hindu practice, like that's my preferred outcome for a number of people is basically that. If you've got the right sort of disposition and the right ability to do it, it's much simpler for everybody involved. One of the guys we're working with in Eastern Europe, over the course of a number of years, that's basically where he's wound up at. He's literally been installing under our sort of guidance and supervision of some of my Brahmins over in India, his own home shrine, which is a completely Hindu home shrine as a result. Obviously, that's not practical or desirable for a lot of people, and therefore we are working with this other paradigm, which is the sort of this hybrid model or the resurrective one. But in terms of, say, liturgy, the fact is that we know that liturgy in the Hindu sphere is carried out in Sanskrit. The reason for this, of course, being Sanskrit, language of creation, eminent with the fabric of the universe, so on and so forth. This doesn't mean that liturgy carried out in ancient Greek or Old Norse is somehow invalid, quite the contrary. Obviously, these other Indo-European languages over in the West have also been quite valid for use. I'm not sure about the metaphysics of them being languages of creation. I'm not sure they're not languages of creation, sort of on the other sort of extent. However, mere speaking is not enough. Intent is also sort of vitally relevant. Another associate of mine actually uses, if somewhat archaic, modern English in some of his sort of ritual operations, and he appears to get some results out of it. So obviously there's an intent dimension to it, which is sort of quite important as well. In terms of translation, therefore, taking ritual structures, which we have, this is how the mechanics of it work in the sort of the Hindu sphere, and then going, okay, we can translate that. It's not simply a matter of translating the language, but also translating the other associations, the other contextualizations which go with it. So, for example, in the Shivling Puja example, which I sort of closed with rather abruptly, we have a stone shivling which we're using to pour milk, or possibly this combination of 5 things on, in order to, how would you say, to reimmanentize the fabric of cosmic order into the universe around us. Rita would be the technical sort of term for that, via this libation. In the Nordic sphere, the ritual sort of undertaking we find in mythology is to have a tree which is being treated with a reasonably cognate, reasonably coherent oblation of this similar, well, basically sort of water of life, if you will, which is similarly sort of white. We then extrapolate that to go, okay, so you don't necessarily need, if you're going to be carrying out this sort of oblation in the Nordic understanding, to be importing a shivling. Obviously, it would be ideal. You can instead have an urmen sul, as of course the continental Germanics would have termed it. You can have one of these sacred trees, as we find sort of in the northern sort of Germanic attestation. The element is cognate with the Hindu element, especially because, once again, in Linga Purana, we find attestation for using trees in exactly the same sort of fashion. So those contextual elements we can translate in that particular regard. But ultimately, it's about a results-based approach. We know these things work. We know they get results. The question is how we get the results when approaching things over here in the Hindu sphere. So to return to your woolly mammoth analogy, if we produce a thing that looks like a woolly mammoth and it's alive, we're considerably further ahead than if we basically just have a bunch of bones or something frozen in the ice. It's not going to be an exactly authentic woolly mammoth. It is unfortunate that these things are forever lost to us in the Northern European sphere. But we can produce something that, whether we're going to be riding around on in the manner of Indra and Aravata, or whether it's for some other purpose, we can produce something which is living, something which is vital, and something which is ours in that particular regard. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Thank you. I think it was a really good point, AJ. Thanks very much for doing that and well answered. I mean, now, I mean, it's, I think the recording's coming up to the 2.5 hours.
Some questions from Mr. Walker, which I do want to get through.
Oh, I think that's already been answered, I think.
There's two further points. I'll make it incredibly brief. The first one is, in terms of the robot thing, Martin Heidegger has some rather useful points about, how would you say, dehumanization. And you're absolutely correct that the situation of the modern age is fundamentally one whereby this dehumanization, mechanization, whatever you want to call it, this soullessness, this disenchantment of the world is going on all around us. One of our foundational roles as people of, I would not speak everybody, but as men of faith out here in what I do, is this re-enchantment of the world. Vakam Garjat Lakshanam is one of my favorite expressions in sort of the Hindu theological canon. It means thunder, bearing the imprintings of divine speech. Now that's pretty much it. Why are people sort of hearing thunder? They just sort of hear a meteorological phenomenon. They can't hear the laughter or the voice of the divine in it. Now, of course, as it happens, one of the interpretations of this maxim is that thunder bears the sort of the signifier of communication because it tells you that somewhere it's raining. But these understandings don't have to be mutually exclusive. Re-enchantment of the world does mean, as Ernst Junger once sort of put it, restoring theology to its rightful place as the queen of sciences. Now, in terms of the cyclical situation, you are correct that there is a teleological approach to the sort of the Abrahamic paradigm, whereas a more cyclical approach for cosmology does tend to take place for the sort of Durham sphere, does take place for the Nordic sphere, and so on and so forth. However, we still wind up being somewhat teleological in terms of our relationship with time. We die, the universe dies. And of course, the only thing that doesn't die is a good story, to misquote the Habermas somewhat. So in terms of our relationship with well, I suppose, cosmic cycles, the universe is getting worse. There's not much, well, actually, there is something you can do about it, and that's stage a glorious last stand and try and fight back as much as you possibly can to sort of re-illuminate things, even though we know ultimately it's all going to end in fire, and that's going to be a net improvement, considering how things are going to be immediately before the fire, so to speak. The pralaya Ragnarok, the ekparosis in the Greek. But the cyclical point which you raised is an interesting one. Now, I do not believe, as I may have sort of mentioned previously, in this notion of gods as sort of abstract and depersonified natural forces. Because if that was the case, well, apart from some of my own personal experiences, which would go in very interesting fashion, we might sort of say. If this was the case, all that prayer would be, to quote the late Terry Pratchett, a sophisticated manner of pleading with thunderstorms. Now, you can possibly say there's some truth to that, and certainly there are cases whereby the enactment of various forms of ritual do wind up having sort of a almost not accidental, but sort of a scientific side effect, if you will. For example, that thing people wrote in Fight Club about human sacrifice and then burning the remains, which produced the loam or things in the river, which then, of course, you can wash clothes and things of that. You get the idea. In terms of cyclical piety, the actual cycle that I think is quite integral for an Indo-European approach, as opposed to perhaps an Abrahamic approach, although it does also somewhat crop up there, is cyclical gifting. I give so that you may give. In Latin, it is called do or des. The direct sort of Sanskrit cognate formulation, which you find in the Yajur Veda, if I'm correct, is dehi me dadamiti. Once again, you can see that dative case being expressed in both particular sorts of cases. We are in a relationship with these gods. We gift, we offer, and you're correct. There can be situations whereby this plays a natural role in an echumeric sense. But I also think that the metaphysical role, the supernal role, the mythic role is absolutely vital in terms of what we are doing there. So I hope that helps to clarify some of those elements and the practical side of things.
Great, thanks very much. Now, Kayla JS and Shurjan Agalag, nice to have you here. Does anyone want, any of you want to say anything briefly before? I think Kerwin is going to end with a few words to allow us to go on our way with something good in our hearts.
You know, I have to say something. I was not finished with my comments. So if you continue to interrupt me, I will finish all this. Okay. So I think I'm not treated fair. So you just interrupt me and so on. And I'm not pleased with that.
Nobody interrupted you.
Well,
yeah, you did, Steve. You did, Steve. I was not finished.
Sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I thought
no, it was not the first time. I think that's not fair. That's not correct.
Okay. Well,
and I hope Kerwin give short answers so that we can have more discussion. It is about how to bridge things. It is not about just discussing what has been going on for 6,000 years ago. It's about real people, real societies, real cultures now. And I don't think much of those things are that relevant. I mean, look at this word pagan. Its root is bak. Bak in Persian means God. In Russia, bog means God. And why not address what the Western, Hebrew, Arab cultures has done to this very notion? The India is not the answer. India is facing between the Iranian Russian and the Western Hebrew and Arabs. And they try to make it to Northern Europe through Caucasus. And then they face Turks and Pakistanis and Israelis and the others in the Caucasian War. Those issues are so much important to the present and the future of the, what you call the Indo-European people. But to me, it's about Iranian and the European people, and India has maybe traditionally been some kind of retreat or exile for both of them. Never forget, India has been hosting the Persian language as its, official language after the English came in, and with their hostile manner, as usual, topple the Persian as the official and introduce. Now the issue is how it is not about what India can do to bridge the gaps. Maybe they can, but they have to play a very active role in the present, and they try to do it with their nuclear and so on. But India has to make a very important choice in Afghanistan, in Iran, toward Russia, and also toward Pakistan and Turkey. So so these issues are the essentials, and I'm very sorry.
Well, yes, thanks. I mean,
those issues are never addressed
because
we are,
there will be another space. I mean, this,
I don't
you know,
think
we
so.
can't
This is
address
about
everything.
Indo-European people, not
No,
the
it's not.
Indo-European gods.
It is about Indo-Europeanism as a religious point of view. It's not about global politics.
Is all? Is all those
You know,
issues about the
Miran,
deities? I don't think so.
Miran, I'm afraid, you know, we've gone on. You know, time is limited, and you know, thank you for your contributions.
I know that, but the discussion could be very much more balanced, and it's your job to moderate and. So
yeah,
that
well,
it
I'd
can
like to
contribute
moderate
to
you,
every one
please.
of us.
Please, thank you. I mean, thank you.
I'd just like to briefly pick up for about 50 seconds. I'll try and keep this short. The first one is, I dispute the etymology of pagan, but you are correct about the situation of we call it in Sanskrit bhaga. It means lord, distributor of things. It's actually functionally cognate with lord and sort of English in terms of local, but I digress. The geopolitical side of things was not what I was here to discuss. I did not know that was something somebody would be interested in. I could discuss that at some other time, certainly. I do think there is some saliency to it, however, because in terms of, to use an example, we have various American associates, and recently, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a border dispute between China and India. In fact, there have been those going on for quite some time. Now, because of our work, these Americans who basically said, oh yeah, so our attitude before sort of meeting you guys was the Indians, they're the guys running the service station down the road, gas station, I think they call it, or they're sweatshop labor countries or something like that. It's nothing to do with us, we don't care. After engaging with us, they basically said, well, okay, this border dispute between China and India, we now regard the Indian side of it as being our kin, our cousins. That means, you know, we've got a stake in this. So you're absolutely correct that in terms of the reinvigoration of this worldview, which sees things as being connected amongst the Indo-European peoples, this can start to have political or geopolitical tangible effect. You're very valid in actually sort of raising that. However, I would also suggest that's possibly something which needs to be worked on over quite some years, and is possibly something which flows from the re-establishment of the ritual concordancy, the mythic concordancy, which can then prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to a lot of people that we are in fact connected in this way. So thank you for raising that point. I'm sorry I haven't had more time to address it, perhaps at some other juncture, and you can also search up my other works looking specifically at the geopolitics of Iran, Russia, and other such situations elsewhere on the web.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, yeah, it's important we try and end on a note of amity between us all, and thanks, Kerwin, very much for giving very generously of your time, your expertise, and having prepared a talk. And thanks those who've stayed, AJ, Michael, Miran, Michael in Amsterdam, Kayla, JS, and Shurjan Agala. Now, Kerwin, perhaps would you like to end with a few words before I blow out the candle?
Yep. I'll present the English translation first. This is only 2 lines, and then I'll mispronounce the Sanskrit involved. Right, so this is from a particular Upanishadic verse. It's originally, and this is interesting in terms of Mr. York's earlier point, it was originally an Agni invocation. However, it's since become a Durga sort of invocation. I chose this particular one because mother goddess in the European peoples, and also fire, so therefore a candle will also be what we've been discussing. So the translation would read, we invoke from the highest place the Ugaran Agni, which is to say the powerful or the furious fire, the Sahamana, the conquering, overpowering, powerful spirit or angry sentience, unvanquishable in battle. May she greatly protect us from the universe's Durgani, which is to say dangers, divinely incinerating, Shama Devo, the great evils, Durita Ati, which also means the very difficult path, with her living in sacred blaze, that being Agni, and of course represented somewhat in the candle which we have in front of us. So, Pratana, Jititam, Sahamanam, Ugram, Agni, Huvima, Paramat, Sadhasat, Sana, Parsad, Ati Durgani, Vishva, Kshama, Devo, Ati Durita, Ati Agni.
Thank you. Kunvantu Vishwam Aryam. Namaste. Namaste, Kerwin. Very, very good to see you. I wish everyone a peaceful evening or a fruitful day. Michael, yeah, have a good night. Yeah, good to see you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, AJ. Yeah, have a good day. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Miran and Kayla, JS, and Shurjan. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.